Το επόμενο μας θέμα έχει να κάνει με την τρίτη διάλεξη του ενδέκατου χρόνου στο Ελεύθερο Πανεπιστήμιο για την Ομογένεια του Λονδίνου, όπου εισηγητής ήταν ο Δόκτωρ Κλέαρχος Κυριακίδης. Θέμα της διάλεξης ήταν το ρεμπέτικο τραγούδι. Συντονιστής ήταν ο Γραμματέας της Εθνικής Κυπριακής Ομοσπονδίας και μέλος της Οργανωτικής Επιτροπής του Ελεύθερου Πανεπιστημίου, κ. Ανδρέας Καραολής. Ας περάσουμε να παρακολουθήσουμε το καλωσόρισμα από τον κύριο Καραολή.
Είναι η ιστορία ο βίος ενός μεγάλου ρεμπέτη του Γιάννη Ιωάννου, για τον οποίο θα μας μιλήσει ο δικηγόρος, ο μελετητής της ιστορίας της Κύπρου, και απόψε θα μας δοθεί ευκαιρία να δούμε πόσο μεγάλη και πόσο βαθιά είναι η γνώση του και για το ρεμπέτικο τραγούδι. Το ρεμπέτικο τραγούδι δεν είναι τυχαίο, γιατί ξετύλισε μέσα από τη Σμύρνη, μέσα από τη φτωχολογιά της Σμύρνης, που αργότερα με την μικρασιατική καταστροφή του 1922 πήγαν στον Πειραιά, μέσα στις παράγοντες, μέσα στις δυσκολίες της ζωής, κατάφεραν να νικήσουν όλα τα εμπόδια, να επιβιώσουν, να δημιουργήσουν και να αφήσουν μία ιστορία η οποία συνεχίζεται. Για τον Κλέαρχο Κυριακίδη θα μας πει μερικά λόγια ο φίλος ο Τζέισον. Εγώ θα πω μόνο κάτι για τον Κλέαρχο, το οποίο δείχνει τον χαρακτήρα και την βαθιά του πίστη στην παροιμία μας και ιδιαίτερα στους Κύπριους νέους της παροιμίας μας. Σε μια από τις ομιλίες του είπε: Young Cypriots in Britain can rise to any position of influence and authority in Britain, whether in politics, business, the civil service, or law. He said that the progressive and educated Cypriot youth of Britain are capable of helping Cyprus through their professional activities, but must also ensure that they focus on other issues of significance to Britain.
Στη συνέχεια, τον εισηγητή παρουσίασε τον Jason Theo George, μέλος της ΝΕΠΟΜΑ Ηνωμένου Βασιλείου. Ας περάσουμε να παρακολουθήσουμε τη σύντομη παρουσίασή του.
Καλησπέρα. Mr. Tony Yerolemu, President of the Greek Cypriot Brotherhood, members of the Executive Committee, ladies and gentlemen. This evening we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Klariakos Kyriyakidis to speak to us. A familiar face in the Brotherhood. He lectures here regularly on very interesting topics, primarily on legal issues relating to Cyprus, but otherwise. And we're very pleased to welcome him here this evening. Klariakos is the senior lecturer of law at the University of Hertfordshire. He's a non-practicing solicitor, past president and current committee member of the West London Law Society, a current committee member of the Society of Modern Greek Studies, and a trustee of the Hellenic Centre. His research interests include the history of the British relationship with Cyprus and the related legal questions on the Cyprus problem, and of course, which is of relevance tonight, a passionate interest in the history of rembetiko and laika. This lecture features in a chapter in his book, which is available at all good bookstores.
No, not yet.
Right, not yet, but it will be, I'm sure. And as Mr. Karoli mentioned, it's on a portrait of Yiannis Ioannou, a refugee from Asia Minor and a pioneer of rembetiko and laika. I'm sure you'll enjoy this evening as much as I will. Thank you very much.
Αμέσως μετά στο βήμα ανέβηκε ο εισηγητής της διάλεξης, Dr. Κλέαρχος Κυριακίδης, ο οποίος έκανε μια εμπεριστατωμένη παρουσίαση στα αγγλικά για το ρεμπέτικο τραγούδι. Ειδικότερα μίλησε για το μεγάλο Έλληνα ρεμπέτη Γιάννη Ιωάννου, καθώς και για τις ρίζες του ρεμπέτικου τραγουδιού που το έφεραν μαζί τους οι πρόσφυγες της Μικράς Ασίας. Μέρος της παρουσίασης του κ. Κυριακίδη ήταν και μερικά τραγούδια όπου έπαιξε ζωντανά ο ρεμπέτης της παροικίας μας Νίκος Σακόλας και η κομπανία του. Ας περάσουμε να παρακολουθήσουμε ένα μικρό απόσπασμα από την ομιλία του Δόκτωρ Κυριακίδη και ένα ρεμπέτικο τραγούδι από τον Νίκο Σακόλα και την παρέα του.
And he was born in the town of Chios on the coast of the Sea of Marmara in Asia Minor, or what used to be known commonly as Asia Minor, in what is now present-day Turkey. And this was just a metaphorical stone's throw away from ancient Troy, as well as Gallipoli, the site of one of the bloodiest battles of the First World War. And it's important to recall that when the First World War began in 1914, Turkey joined the side of Germany as an Axis power fighting against the British. And it was as a result of that act of aggression by Turkey against the British that the British responded by annexing Cyprus, and Cyprus thereby became a British colony. So Baba Ioannou was born in quite an important and historic year. Now in 1914, Chios was largely populated by Greeks. And again, although sources vary, it seems that the Greeks numbered approximately 20,000 to 25,000 or so. I need to find more authoritative figures, but that's the rough estimate that I've found so far. And that equated to around about 80% of the population. So very similar to Cyprus. But Chios has other things in common with Cyprus. Greeks had lived in Chios since antiquity, and largely owing to its location, its port, and its strategic importance, Chios had fallen into the hands of successive imperial rulers, including those of Athens, Persia, Alexander the Great, Rome, Byzantium, and of course Ottoman Turkey. So Baba Ioannou was from Chios, and I'll just show you just roughly where that is. You take the map on the left, you can see the Sea of Marmara in relation to Greece. The Dardanelles, where the Battle of Gallipoli was fought, is there. Constantinople, or Istanbul as it's now known, is there, and Chios was about there, just north of Brusa. So that's where Baba Ioannou was born, and this is a blow-up map, and you can see Chios there on the eastern corner of the Sea of Marmara. His father, however, was from Attalia, which was Antalya as it's now known, which is to the northwest of Cyprus. But he resettled in or near Chios, met Baba Ioannou's mother, who was the daughter of landowners, and he himself went into business. He was in transportation, shipping, and he made a decent income. And in common with many migrasiades, he was commercially minded and invested in property, real estate. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the history of the Greek-Turkish War from 1919 to 1922. I don't want to say very much about it, but as so often happens in Greek history, the Greeks made a mistake, a terrible mistake, as a result of an unwise decision, and that gave the Turks an opportunity to exact revenge and unleash an unlawful, unethical, unjust response. And exactly the same thing happened in 1974, and it's happened so often in history. The crucial thing about 1922 is that it resulted in this Greek advance on Ankara. It backfired on the Greeks, and the Turks launched a ferocious backlash. And caught in the crossfire of this backlash were not just the armed forces of Greece, but innocent human beings who were bereft of the legal and other mechanisms which exist today to protect human beings, at least in the civilized West. And what happened was that this area of Turkey that you see on the map on the left was largely, well, in sizable part populated by Greeks, and the Turks embarked upon what can only be described as a campaign of ethnic cleansing. The Turks wanted to rid their territory of ethnic Greeks, even though and Armenians and others who were Christians or non-Turks. They wanted and the Turks were defined as Muslims later. So the Turks embarked upon this campaign, and Chios was not exempt from this campaign. And I just want to read to you something that Aristotle wrote in the Politics more than 2,500 years ago. Man, when perfected, is the best of animals, but when separated from law and justice, he is the worst of all. And armed in justice is the more dangerous of all. If man does not have virtue, he is most unholy, and indeed is the most savage of animals. And I would suggest to you that what occurred in 1922 and in the years preceding it bore out the wisdom laid down in those majestic words of Aristotle. Let me read to you. That, by the way, on the right is a photograph of Smyrna. I haven't found a photograph of Chios being evacuated by the Greeks, but that gives you an idea as to the chaos and the suddenness with which the refugees had to leave Asia Minor. I've translated this from the memoirs of Baba Ioannou, so forgive me if the translation is not 100% perfect, but this will give you a flavour as to what he experienced in 1922. I was 8 years old when I lost my father in 1922. At that time, with the Asia Minor catastrophe, my mother, my grandmother, the mother of my mother that is, and I fled from Chios, and we headed by boat for Greece. I remember that ordeal as if it was a nightmare. There are images in my mind which have never gone away. People cried for help, but the sea was filled with blood, clothes, and other debris. We were economically independent and had a large property portfolio in Chios. But when we fled, all we took was one pillowcase, icons, photographs, and some title deeds or contracts written in Turkish. Is that familiar to anybody here? Or anybody who has relatives from Cyprus? Now, why did Baba Ioannou, his mother and grandmother, flee Chios? Well, I've given you the broader explanation. It's to do with the Greek-Turkish war and the backlash launched by the armed forces of Turkey. But the immediate reason is to be found in the memoirs of Baba Ioannou. I saw people being ruined. I saw blood. I saw misfortune. Can you imagine that? Eventually, the Turks started entering our village, and we fled in a traumatic state. We just managed to embark upon a boat together with some uncles of mine from my mother's family. And with the painful benefit of hindsight very much in mind, Baba Ioannou adds, this is in his memoirs, everyone was saying that the state will sort things out and we would return. Everyone believed that. Is that familiar? Such hopes never materialized. In fact, as part of the post-1922 Greek-Turkish rapprochement, culminating in the Treaty of Lausanne of 1923 and the subsequent Convention of 1930, those who became refugees either before, during, or immediately after 1922 were not only prohibited effectively from returning to their homes and properties, their properties were confiscated effectively by force of law, and in return they were given paltry sums by way of compensation. The same fate befell, one has to add, the Turks who became refugees after 1922, after they were compulsorily uprooted from Greece and dispatched to Turkey, purely on the basis of their religion. This was before the days of the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act and anti-discrimination laws and Nelson Mandela doing away with apartheid in South Africa. This was the era when racial and religious discrimination was commonplace. I'm going to read to you now from something that was written by Sir John Hope Simpson, a British former Liberal MP who was the Vice President of the Greek Refugee Settlement Commission. During the Great War, 1914 to 18, and in the 2 years 1922 and 1923, there was an influx of 1.25 million new inhabitants into Greece, whose total population at the time was not more than 4.3 million. That resulted in an increase in the population of Greece of 28.9%. And approximately 500,000 Turks went in the other direction from Greece to Turkey. Now, on the one hand, this compulsory exchange of populations was regarded at the time as being in the interests of a post-war Greek-Turkish rapprochement, not to mention the racial and religious homogenization of both Greece and Turkey. But on the other hand, Baba Ioannou, now we individualize this, because there were hundreds of thousands affected, but Baba Ioannou and others became the innocent victim of what I would describe as unethical, unequal, and unjust acts of political expediency. Indeed, Baba Ioannou was the victim of racial segregation, a collective expulsion, and what would now be termed genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and human rights violations. And I would even go one step further and say that the uprooting of the Greeks from Asia Minor in this campaign of ethnic cleansing formed the essential chronological and political backdrop to the uprooting of the Jews from their homes in Germany and Axis-occupied Europe during the Second World War. The template was provided by what occurred to the Greeks in Asia Minor. One can only speculate, but if the so-called international community had put its foot down and actively prevented rather than actively encouraging this exchange of populations and the extinction of the Greek communities of Asia Minor, perhaps Hitler's Germany might have thought twice about embarking upon the Holocaust. As it is, we've ended up in this devastating history of Asia Minor. Now, we've heard the magnificent song Do Megalo Psari Troi Do Mikro. I have to emphasize here the lyrics belong to the Athens-born Kostas Manesis, who was born in 1917 and died in 2002. The music that you heard was written by Baba Ioannou, and he sang it. Now, let me just move on to say a couple of other things before we listen to maybe a song or two. The themes that we have become familiar with in the context of Cyprus were familiar to Baba Ioannou. The concept of xerizomos, being uprooted from your home, or diogmos, being thrown out of your home. Prosphia, tsandiria, οι παράγγες, the καταγερματισμός, the fragmentation of society. Το δεν ξεχνώ. All of these concepts that we have become familiar with in Cyprus were experienced by Baba Ioannou. Let me read to you what Baba Ioannou said. Let's go back a bit. Let's go back to that again. This is what he describes in the aftermath of leaving his village. The suffering now started. Whoever lived through these things know about it. To others it seems like a fairy tale. The boat we embarked on at Chios did not even have water. So we drank water from the sea. I remember this as if it was now. Whoever had fresh water therefore survived, but so many mouths needed to drink. We even drank from the pipes containing condensation from the exhaust system of the boat after the steam had heated up. We allowed the condensation and liquid to cool down before we drank it. We made a stop in Samothragi. This is an island in the northern part of the Aegean. We made a stop in Samothragi and a few people disembarked to fill some barrels with water. However, when the barrels were brought onto the ship and we sailed off, we discovered that the water had frogs in. It suggests the filthy conditions that the water was extracted from. The women took out the scarves they wore on their heads, and the water was filtered through these before we drank it. No wonder so many refugees who managed to escape the clutches of the Turkish armed forces later succumbed to disease. Now, it's difficult to exaggerate the suffering that Baba Ioannou and his fellow refugees experienced. And I'm going to quote to you again from that British gentleman, Sir John Hope Simpson. It's estimated that, the refugees arrived in the ports of Greece and in the islands in the tens and hundreds of thousands, without food, without clothes, in a state of indescribable filth, covered with vermin, and naturally bringing with them epidemic diseases, of which the worst was typhus. It's a fever. Now, the memoirs of Baba Ioannou are rich in the details which illustrate this very point. He tells us that so they left Samothragi, and then they were placed in a church in Thragi, northeast Greece. They were effectively dumped there. And then he writes, after a period of time, they likewise expelled us from the church in Thragi, and brought us down to Birea, to St. George in Gerazzini, where insane people were kept. That suggests they put them in an asylum. They placed us in certain storage rooms which were full of worms. Fresh torment followed. They can never be forgotten. Then Xechno, the theme. They put us in quarantine and put our clothes into a medical furnace for sterilization purposes. However, the local people stole our clothes, whatever we had, even our shoes. How can such things leave your mind? In other words, having suffered the indignity of being uprooted from their homes, the refugees from Asia Minor suffered additional indignity in Greece at the hands of some, though certainly not all, some locals who turned their noses up. There were, however, some local Greeks who embraced the refugees, and an example was Gabedan Andrea Zebo, who I read the other day from a book, and I'm going to source all of this in my paper with all the footnotes and the details. He was born in Athens to parents from Aivali, which was a town on the coast of Asia Minor which was effectively ethnically cleansed by the Turks prior to and during the First World War. And Aivali was the precursor to Smyrni. So Gabedan Andrea Zebo, which Mr. Elena, he very kindly used to play for my sister to dance to, was a historic figure. He had a sailing boat, a fishing boat, and he used to give work to the refugees to make ends meet. And this was our magnificent singers and performers are going to play. I'm going to just introduce them to you briefly. Nico Shagola is from Gokkino Drimithia, and he's the rembeti of the Barigia, one of the rembetes of the Barigia. I'm one of them as well, but he's the man. And he's brought two colleagues with him. Yanni from Ayadriada in Yalusa, near Yalusa, so comes from a refugee background, and Andrea Papadopoulou, who's from Larnaca. And they're going to now perform Gabedan Andrea Zebo, which you can sing to.